Good evening. My name is Nolan Vare. I'm a sophomore politics major and a Kevin Harrington student ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to remind you to please turn off all electronic devices. Also, following tonight's discussion, there will be a brief question and answer period. Tonight's speaker is Governor Howard Dean. Mr. Dean began his political career in 1982 after being elected to the House of Representatives of Vermont, where he served until 1986 when he was elected lieutenant governor. Mr. Dean assumed the position of governor of Vermont in 1991, where he would be elected to serve 5 two-year terms of office. His 12-year span in that post makes him the second longest-serving governor of Vermont in the state's history. After a presidential bid in 2004, Mr. Dean was elected to serve as the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, where he employed his 50-state strategy, which focused on Democratic successes in fundraising and elections in all regions of the country and levels of government. Mr. Dean's discussion, entitled Healthcare in the Private Sector, Reform is Still Possible, will focus on what he believes are a number of unintended consequences in the Affordable Care Act that will move the United States down the track of having a wellness system instead of an illness system. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Governor Howard Dean.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to make one correction in the introduction, although you probably read it as was, so whoever gave it to you is their fault, not yours. So I'm actually not the longest-serving governor, or I'm not the second longest-serving governor in the state's history. I'm the longest-serving governor in the state's history. And the reason that I'm the longest-serving governor in the state's history, I love to bring up this fact, even though those of you in New Hampshire may not know this, is, and I love to particularly bring this up in Texas because it drives them crazy. We declared independence from the United States in 1777, but we were not admitted to the Union until 1791. And since New Hampshire claimed half of us, we were, of course, very enterprising even in those days. Our capital was actually in New Hampshire for 2 years. We moved it around for a while. And New York claimed the other half. We claimed we were an independent republic. So Vermont was an independent republic from 1777 to 1791. Now, I served a little less than 12 years as governor. And the reason I'm the longest-serving governor in the history of the state is the first governor of Vermont served for 17 one-year terms. But 9 of those terms when Vermont was a republic, and 8 of those years were when Vermont was a state. So I am the longest governor in the history of the state of Vermont. So eat your heart out, Sam Houston in Texas is all I can say. Karl Rove used to say that Texas had driveways that was longer than our interstate system. And he got a big laugh until I turned around and said, yeah, and Texas has 22% of their children with no health insurance, and we have about 4% with no health insurance in our state. That went over really big in front of Texas audiences. So let's talk about health insurance in Texas. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the economics of health care, because the assumptions that are made about the economics of health care basically are wrong. And particularly on the Republican side, they simply have no idea how health care works. And they keep talking about market-based reforms. The problem with market-based reforms is in health care, competition drives prices up, not down. And in health care, the entire reimbursement system and the entire incentive system, unlike everything else in capitalism, drives us to spend as much as we possibly can. It doesn't drive prices down, which explains why somebody like Paul Ryan, his plan is so unpopular and so silly. Because what he suggested that we do to save the government's budget is to transfer the risk from the payer, which is the government in the case of Medicare, to the patient. And their theory is if patients can be empowered to buy health insurance, they'll make smart decisions. To buy health care, they'll make smart decisions. the idea does everybody know what an HSA is? Okay, it's a health security account. It's a darling of some right-wing foundation. I don't remember which one. And it's not a terrible idea. The health security account is basically your employer, instead of giving you health insurance, gives you a health insurance for catastrophic appearances and then gives you, let's just say for the sake of argument, $500. If you don't use it by the end of the year, you get to take it. So there's an incentive for you not to spend too much money. The problem is it works really well if you're trying to decide whether you should stay home for a couple of extra days and maybe see if it really is the flu or not before you run off to the doctor. It saves you $100 or whatever it costs these days for an office call. That's great, but that's not where the money is in healthcare. The money isn't in $100 office calls. It's in $100,000 coronary artery bypass grafts and $250,000 drugs a year for cancer. And it has no effect whatsoever. I want you to think about how people consume things. If you want to go down and buy a car, maybe you don't own a car. So you go down, let's just say you go to the Ford dealer, and you want this, but there's a lot of gizmos that you want, and it drives the price up, and you just can't afford it. So you downsize it a little. You go to a smaller car, a smaller model, and they look at all the stuff, and you decide, well, I really don't know if I can afford that. Then you go across the street maybe to the Kia dealer, and you see maybe you even decide, I can't buy a car this year. I'm going to take the bus for another year and try to save some more money. All rational stuff. That's what consumers and capitalism is built on, is people making rational decisions about economics. In healthcare, it doesn't work that way. If you're really sick, you don't argue with the doctor about whether you need something or not. I practiced for 10 years. Not one time in my entire 10 years of practice that I had a guy get off my table and my examining table with crushing substernal chest pain and say, Doc, the guy down the street does it $2,000 cheaper. I'll see you later. It doesn't work that way. My favorite story about how, and this has nothing to do with patients not knowing anything or not knowing enough medicine or any of that stuff. Doctors are the worst patients there are, and nurses are the second worst. I'll give you an example because the more you know, in fact, the less rational you get when you're buying something that's life and death. Because it's not like buying a Ford. Worst thing that happens is if you can't buy a car, you ride the bus. But if you make a mistake while you're buying something that's healthcare, you may not come out of the office conscious or at all. So people do not think the way they do when they buy health care the same way they do as when they buy a Ford. And the example I always like to talk about is when I was a second-year resident, I was in charge of the coronary care unit on my rotation. And one night, the nightmare of all comes in. The chairman of the cardiac surgery department has a massive heart attack, and he is now my patient in the coronary care unit. I'm a second-year resident. I am terrified. And he comes in, and in those days, we didn't have all the drugs and stuff you have. I know everybody thinks drugs are really expensive. They actually drive costs down, because when I was practicing 30 years ago in the coronary care, 40 years ago in the coronary care unit, you were in there for 14 days. Today, you're out in 3, and you get all these drugs, and that lets you go home. So it actually saves money. But in those days, we didn't have all that stuff. So when somebody came in with a big heart attack, and this guy had a really big heart attack, you basically gave him some stuff to keep his blood pressure down, to minimize his heart work, and some sedatives and so forth, and some fluid balance, and paid attention and hoped for the best. And that was about what you could do. So we settle him in. He's okay. He's doing all right. Next day, you check off rounds, and he's had a good night, and we're nervous, but because he's not through the unstable part yet. And all the way down at the other end of the hall, about 50 yards down at the other end of the hall in this coronary car unit, is the step-down unit. It was where you go when you go home. You sort of move down and get to a place where you're stronger and stronger, and finally you get discharged. So this lady who's about to go home has a cardiac arrest. Code 99, everybody runs just like you see in the television shows, and people are squeezing fluids and pumping and mouth to mouth and bagging and blah, blah. It's chaos, right? That's what always happens. So we're trying to run this thing and get a pulse back and all this. And who should appear at the door but the chairman of the cardiac surgery department, who's pulled out all his tubes, got himself in a wheelchair on his second day post-MI, and his rationale is, who better to run a code 99 than the chairman of the cardiac surgery department? He rolls himself 50 years down the hole with an anterior MI and sits there in the room trying to tell us what to do. Doctors are terrible patients. We are not rational creatures, particularly when we are sick. So we are terrible consumers of health care, even though we know more than most people who know when they're consuming health care. So why do I tell you this? Because the economic model that most of the health care plans are built on, and most of the so-called reforms that you hear about, are all about what happened, are all about the same model that you use when you buy a car. They don't take into effect the extraordinary differences when you are the consumer of the most expensive health care in the world. You can be a good consumer and make rational, reasonable decisions about whether you ought to go to the doctor or not. And if there's a little financial incentive not to go, I don't think that's bad. If you're older and you have some chronic diseases, that is bad. But if you're young and healthy, HSAs work. But all the stuff that was being suggested in Washington assumes that we work on the same free market economics that every other market works on. It's not true. And so I start with that because I want you to understand that is the context of everything we're about to say from here on. It's not true. We do buy health insurance well. We can make rational decisions, because we're usually not sick when we buy health insurance, about what our individual budgets are, what our tolerance for risk is, and we can make smart decisions about health insurance, because we're not usually making it when we're an extremist or have some terrible problem that we're so deeply emotionally tied up on. But we don't make good market-based decisions when we're an extremist. And that's when the really, really expensive health care, that's when hospitalization happens, that's when the kinds of things I was talking about before with big operations, that's when very expensive drugs happen. That we don't do a good job consuming. It's not because everybody doesn't have an MD, because we've just shown anecdotally that when you do have an MD, you're even worse at making the decision, because you can't estimate risk, and you're not likely to subject yourself to the risk-reward decisions that you make when you're buying a car. It's a different thing. So I want you to keep that in mind, and now I want to talk about some things in this bill that nobody who voted for it or wrote it had any idea were going to have any kind of effect. But I think there's a possibility that Obamacare actually does transform health care, although nobody had any idea it was going to do this. And neither did Governor Romney, by the way, who was the presage to Obamacare. It is true that I know the propaganda machines in Washington tell you all this different stuff. It is true that the Heritage Foundation designed the basis of Obamacare, and it is true that this is before Jim DeMint came along, the Heritage Foundation was conservative, but they weren't crazy. And it is true that the Heritage Foundation designed the basis of Mitt Romney's Romneycare in Massachusetts, and it is true that the same consultants from MIT and elsewhere from Massachusetts who put together Romneycare in Massachusetts and made it work were also very much involved in putting together Obamacare. This is a free market solution, supposedly, but as we're going to find out, it may end up being a different kind of free market solution. And this is a private sector solution. No matter what your position is, and mine was not this bill. I didn't support this bill when it was passed. In fact, I actually hoped that Senate would vote it down so they could start all over again. Because we came, by the way, just for the interest's sake, we came within one vote of a public option. We had the votes for it, and Joe Lieberman, of course, once he realized the progressives liked it, had to be against it, and he killed it. One vote. And I was every night I was talking with Reid and Schumer about what was going on, and it was one vote that cost us the public option. That would have changed everything. But we did get, so the decision that was made 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago when this was passed was that we would have universal health insurance in this country, or we would approach it, and we would do it in the private sector. So you can disagree with that decision, and I did, but that's what we passed. So we're going to reform healthcare in the private sector. Has this ever been done? Yes. The Swiss have a private sector health insurance system, and the Dutch have a universal private health insurance system. There has to be a lot of regulation, but it can work. So we've passed that debate. We can have that debate some other time if we want, but we've passed this bill. We got to get it to work. And what should we do? Well, here are the two things in the bill that nobody anticipated. Now, one, I actually think they did anticipate. Nobody wanted to admit it until the McKinsey Corporation exposed everybody. But the first and the really big one is the development of something called the ACO. Now, I'm going to try not to use too much jargon here because I know what that's like and it's daunting. An ACO is an accountable care organization. It's a prominent feature of the bill. What an ACO does, an accountable care organization, is essentially vertically integrate health care. So you have in one company or one structure, and the state laws are different, so California has to do it a little differently and stuff like that. But in one company, you have the same person who operates on your heart and who cuts your grandmother's toenails in the nursing home, all working for one company or one big contractual organization. Now, why did they put this in the bill? They did it for quality assurance. They wanted electronic medical records, so you wouldn't find somebody who went to Dr. A over here for the liver and Dr. B over here for a broken leg and Dr. C over there for the heart, and none of them talked to each other, so there wasn't a good way to keep track of what was going on. So the thinking in the bill was, we'll have these vertically integrated companies, and they'll have electronic medical records, so if the person who does clip your grandmother's toenails in the nursing home nicks her toe and needs to be treated, he can go or she can go and punch up the electronic medical records and find out that you shouldn't use penicillin to treat this infection. That's the kind of stuff they were trying to fix. It was a sensible thing to do. It's quality of care. It's the universality of information, and it was designed to have maximal information about the patient so you could treat the whole patient. But here's the unforeseen consequence. If you're an ACO, and you can offer every kind of care inside a single organization, you don't need an insurance company. And you don't have to charge people fee for service either. The reason that costs go up so much in our system of healthcare, and have for 30 or 40 years, and still are today, all the Vermont people are so proud that their hospital budgets only went up 3%. What was inflation last year? It's about 1.1, still 3 times the rate of inflation. I'll grant you 3% looks much better than 9 when I was governor, but that's when the inflation rate was 3.5%. Still going up, 3 times the rate of inflation. The reason it does is because we get paid to do as much stuff as we possibly can to you, whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work, we do more and get paid for that too. Fee for service drives costs up. Incentives do work. We get paid to do as much stuff as we can. There's actually a cardiologist on staff, a retired cardiologist on staff at the Fletcher. I'm willing to bet at almost every hospital, big hospital in America, who's there to make sure more cardiac catheterizations are done. Not there to study to see if you need more, there to get them done. People used to love the Surgicare centers because the right wing thought, oh, this is going to drive costs down. Yeah, it drives costs down for gallbladders, which are used to subsidize open heart surgery in the big hospitals. So you drive costs down over here and they go up in the hospitals because now you don't have more expensive gallbladder operations subsidizing. This is insane, the system we have. And the more stuff you have that you provide, the more incentive there is to do more. I'll give you a perfect example. This is one of the reasons I came into New Hampshire. Wasn't just the scream. It was I said things like this in Iowa when I was running. So I'm out touring a hospital in Sioux Falls or Sioux City, and these are very proud people, and they're just so pleased that they could take this candidate for president who's running for this doctor who's running for president, right? And around there. And they say, we're going to put a cardiac catheterization lab right here. That is a very lucrative procedure for hospitals. They get paid a lot, and so do the cardiologists for doing this kind of stuff. So they're going to put a cardiac cath in. And the unspoken thing is this is going to be a great revenue center, and it's really going to be good for the hospital. And now we're going to have a lot of thoracic surgery because you can't, one thing leads to the other and so forth. So I'm looking around. These people are great people, and I'm, being polite. And I finally said, well, you have another hospital in this town. It's a pretty good-sized town. Oh, yeah, there's one 4 blocks from here. Do they have a cardiac catheterization lab? Why, yes, they do, and that's one of the reasons we want to have one. Then I said, do you have a CON process in this state? That's called a certificate of need process. It means the government gets to decide whether you can invest in the hospital or not because they know it drives costs up. I said, why, yes, we do. Well, I said, well, if I were the governor of Iowa, I wouldn't let you have a cardiac catheterization lab because you don't need to in this city. Well, if you say those kinds of things, you don't get the vote. So this all contributed to But the reason is that when that cardiac catheterization lab opens, they have to pay for it. And the way they pay for it is to do more cardiac caths. Now, it's not like we're all a bunch of crooks. I don't think there's any more crooked doctors than there are teachers or whatever. I really don't. I mean, there's a certain percentage of people everywhere who cheat, but most of us don't. We're in it for the right reasons. But the incentives are enormous. Here's how it works. It doesn't work that, oh boy, today I just can't wait to do 973 cardiac catheterizations and charge you guys $5,000 a piece for them. There's a few people like that. Most of them are not. Here's how it works. Somebody comes in who's sick, and there's a question. And we do a cardiac cath, and we take it back, and we look at it carefully, and we're not sure about something. We're not quite positive. But maybe if we went back and did another one, we could get the final answer. And you can substitute MRI or CT scan or any expensive procedure you want here. Maybe if we just did one more. And actually with an MRI, it's easier because the cardiac cath, there's actually some morbidity to it. There's some risk, so you don't want to do that if unless you have a pretty good reason for doing it. But there's no downside to doing it because the hospital makes more money, you make more money, and you convince yourself that you could use the information and it's worth the more money, and it's no skin off the patient's back because the insurance company's paying the bill. That's how healthcare works. That's why all these procedures drive up health insurance. And that's why the more ability you have to do procedures, the more the costs go up. Now, what does this have to do with the ACO? If you control all the procedures that somebody could get, and you simply get paid a flat fee for every patient in the system, now you have an incentive not to do procedures. Now you make money essentially by saving money. Let's say you get 10,000, you have 100,000 patients in your catchment area, you get $10,000 a piece. That's your budget for those patients for that year. You don't get a dime more, even if everybody needs a heart transplant. Now, there's some potentials for abuse here. You're going to have to, no matter what system you have in this country, there's some potentials for abuse. But the ACO, look, hospital executives are smart. The reason they're not innovative is because they've been paid for 30 years, 3 times the rate of inflation for doing the same thing. But they're not stupid, and they're going to figure this out. And you know how I know they're going to figure this out? Because in Massachusetts, which has had Obamacare for 5 years, Partners, the largest conglomerate of healthcare and maybe the best in the country, or the world even, has bought an insurance company. And the hospitals that compete with them in the collar around Boston suburbs have been bought by insurance companies. Those guys can now go on the exchanges. They can compete with Anthem and Blue Cross, who don't deliver health care. All they do is aggregate and spread risk. Well, inside an ACO, you determine yourself how you want to spread that risk, and you control the expenditures. So what I'm saying here is an ACO, although it was designed for the quality of care, is now going to be able to co-compete directly with health insurance companies, and they're going to do it 20% cheaper because 20% of a well-run health insurance company, 20% of that money goes to totally non-healthcare expenditures. It goes to billing, it goes to big CEO salaries, and it goes most of all to shareholders. So 20% off the top, an ACO can beat, a well-run ACO ought to be able to beat a health insurance company anytime on the exchange where the competition is. Now, in the bill, it doesn't say an ACO is going to turn into a health insurance entity, or basically an HMO. It doesn't say that. But a smart hospital executive could do that for a flat fee. Now, the first thing you're going to say is, well, geez, didn't we have HMOs and didn't everybody hate them? True. I actually worked for an HMO. I had about a third of my patients when I was first practicing were HMO patients. I get $15 a month for the patient, whether they came in or not. It was a great way to practice. I never sent a bill. I never had to worry about collections. I never had to worry to see if the patient came in. I only had to do that when I thought it was medically necessary. Somebody had a problem that I knew was chronic, and I knew exactly what the problem was. I could treat them over the phone, never having to think about, well, gee, how am I going to pay the nurse if I keep doing this? It's not a bad way to practice medicine. What killed HMOs? It wasn't the way it was practiced. It was the health insurance companies when they went to Wall Street. Because HMOs were an up-and-coming thing, and they were a great idea. And, of course, when they're a great idea, somebody's going to make money on it, and they did they took them public, and they went on the stock exchange. And the minute they did that and they became publicly held companies, their boards of directors had 2 problems. One was the fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, which is to make as much money as they can and make the share price goes up. And the other was the moral responsibility of their patients to make sure they get good care. That wasn't a problem either until the market got saturated. And when the market gets saturated, then you got to make those numbers every quarter by cutting costs. And they cut costs at the most vulnerable levels, which were patients and primary care physicians. And that's, how many of you ever saw John Q? Nobody under 30, of course. John Q is a fantastic movie. He's Denzel Washington. It was in the 90s or late 1980s. And it was at the height of the HMO movement. People hated John Q was this guy whose kid got terribly sick, and the HMO was trying to stick it to him, and the kid was dying and all this stuff. And I think he ended up shooting up an emergency room or something. And when the scene came where he just said, "I'm not going to take this anymore," the entire audiences all over the country rose up in a movie theater and gave the screen a standing ovation. It was an incredible phenomenon. It was the end of the HMO movement. But it wasn't because HMO's bad. At Kaiser, HMOs work great. And why do they work great? Because they keep the primary care doctors really happy. And when the primary care doctors are really happy, they tell their patients what kind of great care they're getting. And when the primary care doctors are really unhappy, as they were working for the for-profit, publicly held, Wall Street traded HMOs in the 1990s, every day their patients were telling them how much the insurance companies sucked and wouldn't they be better off getting a different insurance company because it was the insurance company's fault that they couldn't get XYZ, even though the doctor thought they should. So if you have these ACOs, you have to remember that most hospitals in this country, the vast majority, and the best hospitals in this country are nonprofit. Florida has the worst health care in this country. I have a feeling it has something to do with the fact that it also has the highest penetration of for-profit hospitals in the United States. Why? Because they run up the tab as much as they can when you get sick, because that's how they make their money. For-profit hospitals are different. They still make money. They say it's not profit, but they have to run a positive balance sheet, and they want to always have a capital fund and get new things. But it's not the same as having to tell your shareholders every quarter that your shares price is going up because your earnings just went up a little bit more than Wall Street thought they were. So what was the downfall of the HMO movement was not the way that HMOs practiced medicine, or didn't. It was ultimately, but the reason that HMOs practiced the way they did was because people on Wall Street were forcing the cost cutting down at the expense of the patients. So what happens under a nonprofit ACO that takes health care dollars and takes a flat fee and ends fee-for-service medicine? The first thing that happens is that the purchasing decisions are made by the people who actually control the purchasing, which is not the patient, not in the big ticket items. It's the provider. When you go to see somebody and you're really, really sick, if somebody says you need a liver transplant, you probably don't disagree. You probably say, if that's what I need, doc, we'll have to do it. Well, that's somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 by the time you get through the years of immunization, drugs, and so forth and so on. There's no consumer input into that. But in an ACO, there's now an incentive. You don't want to have to pay $500,000 if you're an ACO which is taking risk for somebody's liver transplant. How do you put it off? Well, you could just cheat and let the person die. Most likely you'd go out of business and somebody would arrest you for violating all kinds of rules, and you'd certainly lose your license. Or you could do what Kaiser does. You could think, if I take care of this person who has these 4 risk factors for liver disease when they're 20, I probably won't have to pay for a liver transplant when they're 50. If I take care of this 25-year-old with diabetes and keep their sugar down and teach them how to do this right, they probably won't need dialysis when they get to be 50. If I get people to stop smoking and do exercise and get them on a treadmill or whatever, et cetera, I'll probably keep their blood pressure down and they won't need to take expensive drugs when they're 50 or 60. All of a sudden, you have now converted our healthcare system from an illness system, which it is today because we get paid when you get really sick, to a wellness system because now you make money when you keep your patients well. Isn't that what we've been talking about for years? The way to get stuff done is to change the incentive system. And an ACO that puts in a flat fee, gets rid of fee-for-service medicine, and just charges a flat fee now has a tremendous incentive because they make more money when they keep you healthy. I think that's pretty incredible. And when they decide what procedures to do and what procedures not to do, that's an internal budgetary matter in the ACO. That is, you may pit the nephrologist against the hematologist against the cardiologist to decide how much money, who should get what in which department. But I think that's much better than having the cost go up at 3 times the rate of inflation, and is much better than trying to present the patient with a bewildering array of options, which is a good thing, because I think people should know their options. I think we've come a long way in medicine in kind of opening up what we do and coming out from behind the curtain. But you can't, it's not fair to ask the patients to make that kind of a decision for the same reason we talked about, and is why I told you the story about the cardiac surgery chief. So the ACO can potentially do, this is not in the bill, do a couple of things. It can change our system from an illness-based system to a wellness system, and it can give the hospital providers an incentive to compete directly with insurance companies. In other words, get rid of insurance companies, which I actually think would be a great idea and a big improvement, because they actually are. I mean, if you think about it this way, today, if you go to your hospital, they're going to send a big fat bill, and they're going to have 9,000 pages of things that you have no idea whether they happened or not. And the bill's going to be up-coded in the hospital billing department so they can make more money. Then it's going to go over to the insurance company, and it's going to be down-coded. And they're going to have a whole bunch of people who say, they didn't really do that. Let's check. Let's inspect. Oh, we could code this differently. Now, you don't need either one of those rooms of 650 people apiece under under a flat rate system, under a pay-by-the-patient system, because you're just going to get what you're going to get. You still need to keep track of what's been done, because you've got to do the research on what works and what doesn't. I mean, you can't just sort of say, now we just do all this stuff. We don't have to worry about it because our pay doesn't depend on it. But now you no longer have all that billing infrastructure on either side. Remember, an ACO actually delivers health care if they can get actuarial expertise. That is, if they can learn what the right charge is given their population, how old they are, how sick they are, and so forth, and make that guess right and go on the insurance company, on the exchange to compete with the insurance company. All the insurance company does is aggregate. They take your money, you choose the provider, they pay the bill, and they fight with providers all the time about paying the bill, a fight which they usually lose, and then the cost goes up 25% the next year because they lost their butts the first time because they guessed wrong or they couldn't make the providers do what they wanted because the power was all in the provider's hands. Now I'm going to shift back for a second because I said something about Paul Ryan's plan on Medicare. If you wanted to fix Medicare and control the cost, because Medicare costs are out of control, not because Medicare is a bad program. In fact, Medicare's overhead is about 4% of the dollars that come in. And what number have we been using here for the overhead in the system we have? 20%. So Medicare is actually a very efficient system. But because all healthcare costs are going up much too fast, roughly 3 times the rate of inflation for 30 years, Medicare is not an exception to that. So Medicare is a huge problem for the federal government. Social Security is not. That's some minor tweaks and we can fix Social Security. But Medicare is, and we got to deal with it. Suppose Paul Ryan had said, instead of shifting the risk from the payer, in this case the government, to the patient on the theory, badly mistaken theory, because these folks have no understanding of how healthcare really works, or human beings really work for that matter, which doesn't surprise me entirely, given the nature of the Republican Party these days. But since they couldn't understand that, they shifted it to the wrong people. You don't shift it to the patients because the patients don't buy healthcare well. And they don't make rational. We don't make, because I'm not any better. I had my hip replaced a couple of years ago. I was a terrible patient. I know nothing about orthopedics. I was telling the orthopedics nurses how to do this and how to do that. My wife, I thought she was going to kill me if I got out alive. And I would have deserved it. So we don't make good decisions buying healthcare, but we do make good decisions buying health insurance. So if Ryan had shifted the burden of controlling costs and maximizing patient benefit from the payer to the provider by saying, I'm going to make the number up because, again, I don't know what it is, but let's say it's $10,000. For every Medicare recipient gets $10,000, and they can take that $10,000. It's not a voucher. It's 100% payment. That's what they get. It's a global budget. That is, the payer has full budgetary control here, which is fair because that's where the political and the economic intersect. So that you'd get a $10,000 thing and you could take it to any ACO or anybody in the exchange you wanted. The risk is shifted not to you, but to the provider. The provider doesn't get any more than $10,000. Now, again, you do have to have regulation because people will cheat and they'll underservice people. That's one of the risks. But people cheat in every system. So that's sort of the ACO piece. That's what I think is going to happen. And I think it's going to happen not just because I dreamed it up, but because there's smart people in the healthcare business who are now going to be incentivized. One thing you do have to say about the private sector, in general, there's a lot more creativity and innovation in the private sector than in government. That's a fact. It's not as much as the Republicans that say. I think their views of government are antediluvian, but it's not a surprise because the review about everything is antediluvian. But the fact is that there is going to be a lot of innovation, a lot of serious thinking, a lot of recrafting the industry in this private sector model that we now are about to embark upon in a few weeks. And I think this is going to be one of the things that I think is going to be very good, is this transfer out of fee-for-service into per capita payment. Last thing I want to talk about before we get into questions and answers and whatever you want to talk about, and I am happy to take questions about non-healthcare related stuff, although I prefer to do healthcare related stuff first, is something that the McKinsey people came out with a study on, which I thought they were right. The Obama administration was furious with me because I thought they were right, and it was damaging to the Obama people thought it was damaging to them, which is they believe, and I believe this too, is that this bill is going to cause an enormous exodus of people from employer-based health insurance to individual-based health insurance when people just go on the exchange and buy their own health insurance. And I think that is great. We have got to break the link between employment and health insurance. Medicare has done that. And here's why we have to do it, leaving aside the healthcare and the political arguments. There's a strong economic argument for this. McCain actually proposed doing this in his ill-fated campaign. By the time he proposed it, of course, the bottom had fallen out of the stock market. It was all about the economy, but it was a smart idea. If you link healthcare to employment, first of all, there are a great many people who are 55 and older or 50 and older who can't change jobs. Because if they do, but they'll never get insurance again. A lot of the people who've lost their jobs during this recent recession can't get health insurance. People won't hire them because they don't want to have to be responsible for giving them health care. Everybody in small business is essentially in two businesses. They run their own business, and then they spend hours every week trying to figure out how to deal with the healthcare system for their employees. Or they don't give their employees health insurance at all, which puts them at a competitive disadvantage. But from a macroeconomic problem, how about this for an idea? Which is why Republicans, if they understood anything, would like this idea. We are at a competitive disadvantage, everybody knows, with China and Mexico and Thailand for labor reasons, for labor cost reasons. Our labor costs are higher. We are also at a competitive disadvantage with Canada and Germany and France and the UK. Why? Because when our businesses over a period of time have a fixed cost that goes up at 3 times the rate of inflation, that means that they are becoming less competitive. And why is that? Because virtually, not the entire, but let's say about 75%, especially of the big companies, they're paying that. The business community is paying about 75% of that. In Canada and Germany and all those other places, the costs are also going up at 3 times the rate of inflation. They're not much better than we are. They start from a lower base, but they're also going up a lot more than they can afford. But when the cost goes up at 3 times the rate of inflation in Germany or Canada or France or other Western competitors, that cost is spread across the entire society, tax base of everybody, not just the business people, not just flow to the bottom line of the business community. It comes out of everybody because the taxes basically support the system. When it happens here, the cost disproportionately falls on the business community if they're in an employer-based system. So every year, among other reasons that American business might be getting less competitive, it's because the cost of increasing health insurance every single year is disproportionately on our business community, so they have more and more trouble competing. If you spread the cost of health care across the entire society, which essentially is what the Obama plan ultimately may do, then I would argue that our businesses are going to be more competitive because they won't bear the same proportion of that cost. Now, getting the cost down is a different matter. We talked about that already. Get rid of fee-for-service medicine. This is something different. Getting employers out of the healthcare business. Now, I don't think we should force them out of the healthcare business. There are some, interestingly, this is paradoxical. I think small businesses are going to leave in a hurry as fast as they can. They're going to have to pay $2,000 per employee. That is so much cheaper than buying health insurance that they'll be happy to pay, and the people will go on the exchange. And especially for low-wage workers, restaurants and so forth and so on, if they give health insurance at all now, they're going to be better off. We did some pricing out of a small business that I know well, and they have 5 employees. The business doesn't give health insurance because they can't afford it. And they are in a Chamber of Commerce plan where the people pay the whole rate, but the Chamber of Commerce aggregates it, so it's not terribly expensive, and it's expensive enough. It's $500 a year for people who are making $24,000. I mean, $500 a month for people who are making $24,000 a year. Price is $290 a month under Obamacare. That's pretty good, and there are going to be a lot of small businesses like that. Let me tell you who's not going to do this, who's not going to dump their patients into the exchange. One is small businesses with high-end employees. If you're making $90,000 or $100,000 a year, your employer is not going to dump your health insurance. Why? Because they are competing with really smart, good other employers to make sure really smart, good employees come to work for them. And the other people who aren't going to do this anytime soon, with some exceptions, are the Fortune 500. Because actually, other than Kaiser, the Fortune 500 have the best wellness programs in the country. And why is that? Because they're likely to have employee longevity. That if you go to work for a small place, you might have 8 jobs in 5 years or 10 years. If you go to work for a big place with big benefits and a lot of stability and you like what you do, you're going to stay there. And you may stay there for a long time. So it's in their best interest to run good wellness programs. The other thing is they can do it. They do it because they can. I've now seen, I've seen gyms where they give you a free gym membership and you think, boy, that's great. I've seen gyms where the company takes attendance at the gym, and if you haven't been there a certain number of times, that's coming out of your pay one way or another, out of your bonus. And the most unbelievable one I ever saw was I went into a company to do some consulting, and we went into the conference room with a CEO who was about 28, and we're sitting there, and there are no chairs in the conference room. Everybody's standing at a desk with a computer console around in a circle, and that's their conference meetings. And I'm not making this up. I went to one place where there was actually a treadmill at each desk, so they were doing this while they were. And I go, this can't be scientifically workable, but maybe it was. Maybe some smart trial lawyer will figure out what happens if somebody slides off the treadmill, and that'll be the end of that. So the point I'm making here, though, is there are good wellness programs. Whatever we transition to is not going to immediately be, I mean, I'm sure there's some single-payer fans in here. We're not going to have a Canadian-style single-payer system in this country. I'm not sure we're ever going to have one single-payer in this system. We may have 4 or 5 single-payers. Remember, we already have a single-payer. Everybody over 65 is in a single-payer. We actually have a socialist system of medicine, too. Oddly enough, the Republicans should like it, because it's the Veterans Administration. 25 million Americans, almost the size of the entire population of Canada, are in a socialist system where the government owns the hospitals, employs all the doctors and all the employees. It's actually rated very highly by its own patients. And we have a free market system, supposedly, in the health insurance. So I think what's going to happen is you're still going to have the socialist system, and you're still going to have the single-payer system, and those are probably going to get bigger over time. And Medicaid may turn into that. And then you're always going to have, I think you're always going to have a private sector system to a certain extent, because even in places like England, which really does have a socialist system, if you have lots of money, you can go down to Harley Street and pay your own physician outside this system. And, my attitude towards that is, the top 5% are always going to get whatever they want because they got plenty of money. Let's not worry about the top 5%. Let's worry about the 95% where we really ought to do something about it and stop wringing our hands over whether somebody gets something. That's just human nature. Let's not fight human nature that much, at least that kind of human nature. So the end of what I see, though, ultimately, is the end of the employer-based healthcare system. Now, we've gone over a little bit about what that means, but why is it important? I go back to something we said earlier. I said that we are terrible at buying health care. We are good about buying insurance. The free market does work. It just doesn't work the way health care is currently structured because all the incentives are wrong. The fee-for-service system skews all the incentive, but it does work. In general, it's a terrific principle. People do make smart decisions about spending money, and it does affect what you get and how people market to you and what their quality of their products are. So now, each individual, right now, for the most part, employer-based health care, chosen by the employer, not the employee. It's more employee choice. Now you can go on one of these exchanges and you can have gold, silver, platinum, and who knows what else, and 4 different insurance companies, except in New Hampshire, which we're going to finish off with in a minute. So you get to pick all kinds of things. And in the aggregate, yes, there will be people who make stupid mistakes and should know more and all that, but in the aggregate, we do that really well. One of the reasons our economy is coming back so much faster than everybody else's in the world is that our economic decisions are not made centrally. 20 or 30 or 50 million business people every day make business decisions, and that plus Ben Bernanke had the only common sense in the world to realize that John Maynard Keynes was right and the Europeans were wrong, been priming the hell out of the economic pump since he was chairman. But those are the 2 things that saved our economy. There is no economic dogma in Washington that controls everything. It's 50 million people every day making aggregate decisions, and aggregate decisions made by large numbers of people often end up right, especially when they're business decisions which are aimed at rationality and not sort of emotional decisions. It's easier to make bad decisions when you get really mad about something, and that's more likely in politics. It does happen in business, but it doesn't happen so often. The bigger the pie and the less centralized the country and the nature of the business. Wall Street makes crappy decisions because they are all at one end of Manhattan and they do stupid things and they convince each other they're right. In politics, there are really some stupid decisions made in Washington because they all talk to each other and they forget about everybody else. But in business, there are millions of people spread all over the country. They don't necessarily talk to each other. They're making rational decisions every single day, and in the aggregate, those rational decisions make sense. Well, that's what is going to happen in the health insurance market. You're going to make rational decisions every day, and if an insurance company... Now, this does require good regulation, which I'm going to say something about, which is going to piss off all the people in New Hampshire, some of the people in New Hampshire in a minute, because we'll get to that in a second. But rational decisions are going to be made. We're going to have a better marketplace if you have 50 million people every quarter or every year trying to decide what kind of health insurance they make, because it's going to move the market, and it's going to move the market ultimately towards quality, because people may be fooled for a short period of time and buy crappy products, and they're going to certainly find out if they did and do something different the next year when they have to sign up again. And it's going to make people buy the best plan for themselves that they think fits their family. And again, not everybody will get it right, but the vast majority will. And secondly, job lock is over if you separate employment from insurance. And a 55-year-old is not going to have trouble getting insurance. There is a flaw in the bill that doesn't quite make that true, and we can go into that in the question period if you want to. They did a lousy job in the community rating, but it's a better one that they had before. Finally, I'm going to talk about Vermont and New Hampshire very quickly because we're both outliers. New Hampshire, I read today, has 1 company on the exchange. That is a screw-up for 2 reasons. First of all, the Bank and Insurance Commissioner should have done something about that. And apparently it excludes Concord or something, or there's not a hospital and there's not in the network. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. It's a state government mistake. That has nothing to do with Obamacare. The second problem is, if you don't have a competitive marketplace, it's your job to go make sure you do. I'm sure there are a ton of big advanced ACOs that can deliver health care in Massachusetts who would love to come up here and compete. They should be allowed to do it. I know for a fact that Dartmouth and Mary Fletcher are forming a single ACO. Well, Dartmouth has a big part of the market up north. They should be able to go on the exchange. And that needs to be, now that's not going to happen in 2014, but it ought to happen in 2015. So if we get stuck with one non-competitive insurance rate, either you have to regulate the hell out of them and tell them what they can charge, which they'll resist, or you got to bring in competition. But that is the job of the state government, to make sure that the market is run right. And the market can't be run right if you only have 1 person on the exchange. The second thing, but there is a remedy. But when somebody comes up and blames if there's problems with the exchange because there's only a single provider and they blame Obamacare, that is not Obamacare's fault. That is New Hampshire's fault. Secondly, in Vermont, we are also an outlier. Now, I think in general, it's better to avoid regulation when you can. I know that sounds Republican, but the fact is, when I was governor, if you can do things by incentive and by competition, it's usually better than doing it by regulation. Not to say all regulations are bad. I don't think they are. But it is hard to comply with. And the nature of regulation and laws, by the way, for those of you who are interested in politics, because most of my life has been in politics. So what we do in politics is we find 5% of the people who are doing a bad thing, and we make a law that applies to 100% of the people, and it drives the 95% of the people who are trying to do the right thing crazy, because now you're in their way with all these ridiculous requirements which most reasonable people wouldn't do anyway, but you've got to fill out all the paperwork. That's how it works. I'm not an anti-regulation person, but in general, it shouldn't be the first port of call if you can help it. But we're going to have to be a lot more regulatory in Vermont than I'd like, and that's because, like New Hampshire, we only have one ACO, because we have one huge teaching hospital in Burlington who've now coupled with Dartmouth, so that even that part of the competitive market is gone. And there's no competition in the delivery system. So if they choose to offer care, first of all, the insurance companies have no leverage over them, because there's only one. This is why when Partners bought an insurance company, all the other hospitals went on the market to sell themselves to an insurance company so they wouldn't be forced. Because what Partners was saying to the insurance companies is, we don't care what your negotiation stance is, and we don't care what you want to pay us. We're going to charge what we want, because you can't sell insurance without having Partners in your mix. Because people in Massachusetts aren't going to say, well, okay, don't worry, I won't go to the Peter Brent Brigham for any reason. Well, it's a little like that in Vermont. You can't sell an insurance policy in Vermont and say, but you can't go to the Fletcher Allen, so they can charge what they want. So in order to fix that, the only way to do that is regulation. And that's too bad, because it's not the optimal way to go, but in small states it may be the only way to go. Ideally, this model was designed to have 4 or 5 insurance companies and then ultimately a competitive market so that you could pit one insurance company against the other. The reason I wanted a public option is I foresaw this. My wanting a public option was not because I'm a dogmatic liberal, although people have accused me of that. It was because I wanted a government standard. If you didn't like what your insurance companies were offering, you could have gone and gotten Medicare. If for whatever reason after a year you decided Medicare wasn't for you and there was too much bureaucracy, you could go back to the private sector. But having that public standard with a 4% overhead was going to be a great thing to have on the exchange in order to regulate the insurance company's behavior without actually imposing a huge pile of regulations. Now we got to go spell out 27,000 pages of regulation to make insurance companies behave themselves. We wouldn't have had to do that in my view, if we'd had a public options. The insurance companies didn't get this. They thought the public option was designed to take all their business. It wasn't, unless they did a terrible job. What they would have had is the opportunity to compete with a baseline organization that was a proven deliverer of health care. I also think politically it would have been smart, because it's a whole lot easier to explain a program that already has 50 million people in it, as we found out the hard way in the Democratic Party, than it is to explain something with a whole bunch of initials that nobody, that as the speaker recommended, we not read before we pass so that we could read it after we passed. So I do think, just in conclusion, that there's not one size fits all just because one state's not like the other. And the way that this is going to be implemented is fascinating to me. We're almost there. In Vermont, we just announced that we weren't going to be able to make the payment deadline until November. That's fine. I'm sure there'll be a to-do about it and call it a failure. It's not really a failure. They weren't ready, and you're not going to buy insurance anyway until January 1st. But we're a small state. This is a small state. You're only going to have a single insurance company in your exchange. That's going to be a problem for you. You're going to have to figure out how to fix that. The big problem for the Obama people is not what happens in Vermont or New Hampshire. That's a local problem, and it matters. But the big problem is, because the Republicans' refusal to engage in the exchanges for political reasons, something like 33 out of the 50 states have no exchanges, which means there is one big federal exchange that's going to run the entire program. That has to be done right. Now, the irony of all this is what the House, which passed a more liberal government-oriented bill, wanted. They wanted a single federal exchange. This was the entree to the single payer. The Republicans, by their refusal to cooperate with the Obama administration's much more moderate free market-based reform, have created what the single payer people wanted in the first place, which is this exchange that covers 3/4 of the country. Tell me they're paying attention in Washington. I don't believe you, but I'll take this result. So that's the big challenge for the Obama administration in the short term, is to get this enormous 33-state exchange, and neither of our 2 states are involved in this, to work properly. Because if it doesn't, it's going to be an enormous problem. And if it does, I actually think from a political point of view, it's going to be an enormous help to the Democrats, but it's probably also going to be a great help to the people of the United States. That we don't hear much about. We don't hear much in Washington about what's good for the public. We can argue all we want about what the Democrats think and what the Republicans think, but I think we probably ought to sometime look at the bottom line for the people of the country. And I want to close by giving thanks to a few Republicans, many of whom I disagree with, and some of whom I'm sure I'll work against in the next election cycle. Rick Snyder of Michigan, John Kasich of Ohio, Chris Christie of New Jersey. There are a number of Republicans who took the Medicaid money. To not take the Medicaid money is not only insane from an economic point of view, it's grossly immoral because it's the most vulnerable people in the society who can't get health insurance any other way. Most of you know that we've had universal health care for everybody under 18 in my state for 20 years. We did it by getting Bill Clinton to give us a waiver to make Medicaid a middle-class entitlement for children, a middle-class entitlement. There is no reason that that can't happen in every state. Texas, where Rick Perry's busy, I'm sure you've read in the paper, running around to all these governors telling them they should move jobs to Texas. I haven't once heard him say that 22% of all the children in Texas have no health insurance under Rick Perry, and 25% of the adults have no health insurance. This is a third world country in terms of their respect for the people who make that economy as great as it is. And those Texas kids are American kids, and that's our business too, and they're entitled to the same kind of health care they have in Vermont. Thanks very much. Representative Moody,
yes,
from the great state of New Hampshire, and voted the #1 legislature in America by The Nation magazine. You didn't know that about Marcia, did you?
Guess this isn't working. Is it?
Yeah.
I want to make one observation real quickly, then I want to ask a question. The observation is that there are 2 votes holding New Hampshire from getting the extension for Medicaid. And we're hoping that somehow or another we can persuade 2 of those Republicans to come over to our side so that New Hampshire can benefit from the Medicaid extension.
Well, if you can't, I'm sure they're up for election in 2014. We'll have some fun.
It's too late then.
Oh, is it?
Unfortunately. The question I have is that I read recently, I am on Medicare.
Right.
And I really, really appreciate Medicare. And if it weren't for that, I would be in deep trouble because I have a lot of different illnesses right now. But I read recently that Medicare would approve transplants. You mentioned liver transplant. However, people will not be put on a waiting list because Medicare will pay for the transplant, but only for the maintenance medication for 3 years. And that's a lifetime maintenance. And so people are not being put on lists for transplants. Can you address that problem?
Well, yes, and it's very complicated. So one of the reasons Medicare patients aren't put on transplants lists has nothing to do with their coverage. It has to do with their age. There are some, at a certain age, liver transplants are really inappropriate. Now, the problem is there's no cutoff in the law, nor should there be. But there's a point at which every human body, is not always the same number in terms of years, cannot function. And the problem with transplant lists is those really are rationed, and there's not anything you can do about it. There's only so many people who die every day in car wrecks who have livers that could be transplanted. Sometimes you can get lucky and you can have a relative who's a match, but it's, older livers aren't so great. So in terms of liver transplants, it's a clumsy rule to say that they won't pay for the immunosuppressive drugs. I'll get to that part in a minute. But in terms of things like liver transplants and heart transplants, these are very, very complicated questions that don't necessarily just have to do with money. They have to do with organ availability. And I think a lot of you are familiar with the case of the 12-year-old girl from Philadelphia who got a judge to classify her as an adult so that she could have a partial transplant of an adult liver. That's great. It's a heartwarming story, but that means there's an adult somewhere who died because they couldn't get a transplant. That's the debate that we're having. This is really tough stuff. In terms of the immunosuppressive drugs, this is actually why in the long run, if you had a good healthcare system that made sense for people under 65, or better yet, put everybody on Medicare, you'd fix those things. Medicare essentially wasn't touched while all this legislation went through. So there's been a lot of rules put in place on Medicare for a long number of years that just wasn't up for debate. So the discussion now is, there's some discussion among the Republicans by default, essentially, with Ryan's proposal of merging Medicare into the rest of the system, because what he was really proposing was essentially a voucher system where you'd get money and then you go buy your Medicare from an insurance company. It makes no sense because, of course, Medicare is run at about a fifth of the price of insurance companies. But until you have a set of rules for the entire healthcare system, you're going to get these weird anomalies where this insurance will pay for that and that insurance, even if it's government, won't pay for this. Medicaid is the same way. Some states have Medicaid cover eyeglasses. I remember John Kitzhaber, when he was a physician, when he was governor in Oregon, they went through this whole process, statewide conversation about what they weren't going to cover in Medicaid in order to broaden out the coverage and get more people coverage. So this is, you've raised a great question. We could talk about this for 6 days or 6 years. And the trouble is you never really come to consensus. All you can really do, and Oregon's done the best job of this of any state, is have a really serious discussion statewide where the media actually takes a constructive role, which they did in Oregon, and hash these issues out, because there are no perfect answers, just like the girl that got the 12-year-old liver met somebody else didn't. And these are really, really hard questions, very hard for society. And then, of course, when you throw yourself into the mix, you have your own perspective that is affected by what happens to you, not just what happens in society in general. Yes?
I have a question about the popularity of the Affordable Care Act. I keep hearing things that the people do not like it. You know, the whole country, at least we're getting that from one side anyways. What is the actual consensus on the...
The consensus is that people don't like the Affordable Care Act. They also don't know what's in it. No, I'm serious. There's just actually a big poll just done, I think maybe by Pew, I'm not sure, where they really had a big sample. And I forgot the exact numbers, but something like 58% had a unfavorable view of of the Affordable Care Act, and 48% didn't know what was in it. So, look, my attitude towards this, we've done as much education as we can. The Republicans have thrown everything at it but the kitchen sink. They've said all kinds of things, many of which are totally untrue. But now we're 3 months away from due date, or we're going to do it. And so people are going to experience it, and they're going to get on the program, and they're mostly going to get health care, which they haven't had for a long time, and they're mostly going to save money. And I actually think that's why the Republicans are so desperate they're willing to shut down the government, because once this bill goes into effect, people are going to realize that it's mostly a really good thing.
Thank you.
Governor, good to see you again. Kath
Thank
Allen
you.
from Peterborough. What can we do in the states to affect other discussions on these issues, health care, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, to make sure that they go forward, the discussions in Washington?
Well, I was about to give you an answer until you said that last sentence. Look, I actually think that for now, at this particular time, the solution to our problems is not in Washington. It's in city councils, it's in town councils, it's in voluntary organizations often put together by 25-year-olds who find 50,000 people like them on the internet and all agree to do something different. Washington's just in a position. I think there are 3 institutions in this country that are broken right now. Wall Street, because they're not allocating capital, they're just shifting papers back and forth. The media, because they don't cover serious things. The media is an essential organization because without them, we're no longer a democracy to keep us accountable, but 90% of the stuff they spend their time on is a waste. And Washington, which is irrelevant, essentially, for the most part. By volunteering, one party's decided we're not going to play. And until the voters want to do something about that, it's not going to change. That doesn't mean we can't change things. We can change enormous things. Things do not change from Washington anyway most of the time. They change elsewhere, and then they move towards Washington. Washington's always the last to know. That's a fact. Social Security, everybody gives Franklin Roosevelt credit for that. That started in the Midwest as a result of the Depression. Most people think the Depression started in 29. It started in 26 in the agricultural states. And people were starving, especially old people, and they put together Social Security programs in places like Kansas and Nebraska. And I think there were 12 states when Roosevelt made Social Security a national program. So I think whatever you do, you have to do it in your home state, which is you've made huge changes in New Hampshire just in a few years, back and forth, trying different things in your electoral tastes. And I think that you're on a track that seems pretty good to me. And I think you've got to support that, but your home communities make an enormous difference. I mean, one of the things, I grant you I live in Vermont, but I'm seeing this all over the country, is, for example, a lot of young people are interested in things like farm-to-table agriculture. Well, that's the beginning of a real sustainable agriculture movement. Sustainable agriculture is not going to be something the governor's candidate thinks up and talks about in a speech. It's never going to happen. It's going to happen when people at the bottom do their own work and decide that they're going to live that way. And so the answer to your question is, I wouldn't wait for Washington to do anything. I'd get it done in your own community, and then other communities will do the same. Yes. And then if somebody has a microphone, I can't see in the back. Okay, so we're going to do, somebody already has a microphone. Oh, pardon me.
Sorry.
Okay, we're going to have a new routine here. The people who have the microphones are going to decide who's going to answer the question. So when you look, don't look at me and wave your hand. Look in the back there.
Quick question. What does an MRI cost?
Well, that depends. Anywhere between what does it actually cost to do, or what do they charge for it?
Have a go at it.
Makes a big difference. The difference that they charge anywhere between $1,000 and $7,000, depending on a lot of different factors, including what the traffic will bear.
Okay.
So there's no real rhyme nor reason. The actual the machine, which is the roughly $1 million, the amortization of that is the big expense. The actual money that goes into actually taking the pictures is reasonably small.
I think the mix in the room tonight is really interesting because you got a lot of people here who probably never questioned what their doctor told them to do. And then you get a lot of people in here who are young, probably students at the college, who every time they want to buy something.
Use the mic.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Every time they want to buy something, they go like this and they, where do I get it and what does it cost? It's absurd. There's two ways that the people in New Hampshire and really around the country are disserved by the healthcare delivery system. And that is, number one, when you go to the doctor, you have no idea what anything costs. And number two, 80%, more than 80% of the primary care doctors in the state of New Hampshire are owned by the hospitals. So their business model, they're not making any money in primary care. Their business model is to funnel people into the system where they make the money. So when I went to my doctor, I talked about getting an MRI. I'm going to send you to Portsmouth Hospital. Well, I know I'm going to pay $2,600, $2,700, $2,800 for that MRI, but I also know that I can go to a freestanding center and get it for $650. The American public is very poorly served because everything is hidden behind the veil of secrecy. And I would have said years ago, how about a one-page bill? A one-page bill that simply says, post your prices, tell us what it costs, and let us make a decision. Because anecdotally, in the state of New Hampshire, there are 2 startup companies, God bless New Hampshire, there are 2 startup companies that now provide a service to the public, which is, you call them and you say, how much does it cost and where else can I go? That's powerful information. That, I would suggest, is healthcare reform. Because now I'm getting information, and it turns out, anecdotally, I can get an MRI on the same machine, read by the same technician, for 400% less than what it might cost me if I had insurance someplace else. What are your comments on?
Okay, so here's the problem. That sounds interesting, and a lot of people have proposed that sort of thing. In fact, there was a big, long article by Steve Brill in Time magazine about this sort of stuff. The problem is that that's really an attractive thing for people who buy lots of things. And it may work for healthcare if you have to have an MRI because you have a medial collateral ligament tear in your knee. But it isn't going to work if you suddenly need a brain MRI because they think you've had a stroke, because then you're going to go to the nearest possible place. So here's what happens. Because what you're suggesting is a good idea, because I'm always in favor of transparency. The problem is, here's how the system adjusts to that. So you decide you're going to get your MRI from the guy that only charges $650 instead of $2,500 or $1,000 or whatever, or a zillion, right? So in other words, you shift your revenue from the hospital to the person, and you save the insurance company $1,400. The hospital, at the end of the year, because a lot of people have done that, suddenly decides they have a $1 zillion deficit. So they raise their rates to cover the $1 zillion. The insurance company can't do without the hospital, so the insurance company raise their rates, and you get shifted anyway because your premiums go up because you just got a better deal with the MRI. If you see, because what you're advocating is not a closed system. What you're advocating is a system that can never be entirely integrated like the free market system for buying a car is. In a car, that doesn't happen when you're buying a car because you don't have to have a car, or you can do something else. You can get a smaller car. But, and the car company doesn't get to pass their losses along to the government, except for recently. So what I'm saying is it's a good idea, but it's not going to solve the healthcare reform problem, because unless you stop paying people fee for service, then you're always going to have people making money only when you're sick, and never is there going to be a reward for keeping you well.
Do you have any thoughts on medical tourism? Because what's going to happen is if what you describe is true and the prices keep going up in the hospital system because people are finding ways to save money as consumers to get the same thing.
Right.
People are going to start to go to hospitals and receive services outside the country. I don't think the medical community ever anticipated that their job was going to get sent overseas, but it's starting to happen.
You know, that is starting to happen. It's starting to happen in a variety of ways. That actually brings up an interesting part about this whole talk about healthcare reform, which we haven't touched on. So whether it happens if you don't change the system and people vote with their feet and do medical tourism or do this open list kind of stuff, or whether it happens because of price regulation, or even in a pay by the patient situation that I'm advocating, what we really have to have a big debate about is innovation. We are the most innovative country in the world in healthcare. We invent practically every instrument there is that creates a new procedure, does advanced diagnostics. I mean, some of you may know that you can now replace an aortic valve, which is a huge operation, without ever cutting somebody's chest open, because there's a balloon type apparatus that you can basically stick through a bunch of blood vessels and end up with a new valve dropped off by a catheter. I mean, these are unbelievable things. Why do they happen in the United States? Because in the United States, you can sell 10,000 of those devices, let's just say for $10,000 a piece, and make a ton of money. In a different system where you didn't pay by the fee for service, or you didn't pay astronomical amounts of money, you don't get that, because nobody in Mexico is going to invent that, because they can't sell 10,000 of them. And if they can't sell at least 4, let's just say we're making this all up, they can't sell at least 4, they can't break even on all the R&D costs. The same is true of pharmaceuticals. So it is really, really complicated. I guess my retort is I don't think it's a bad thing to do any of the things you're talking about. I just don't think if we keep paying people fee for service, we're going to have this really warped system that's going to continue to be warped no matter what you do. And medical tourism, or which sort of could be in country or out country based on the example that you're using, will have some effect, but it'll be a peculiar, unpredictable effect, because it really is like squeezing a balloon, and if you save money here, more pops out there, and it all comes out and hits us in the pocket, because the insurance companies are essentially the aggregator of costs. So when you save money in the MRI, somebody else has to pay the difference, so the hospital keeps going. Let me say one more thing about hospitals. It's something nobody ever thinks about. You know why this system is persistent and why it's going to be so hard to change it? Because of hospitals. And is it because the American Hospital Association has such a great lobbying organization? Absolutely not. Who was on the board? First of all, we have a nonprofit model in this country. I would guess that 80% of our hospitals are nonprofit at least. Okay? Who was on the board of your nonprofit hospital? Think about who's on the board. Probably the most prominent citizens in the place, right? Probably, by coincidence, both Republicans and Democrats. Probably they're pretty wealthy, because the hospital nonprofit wants to help get some raised money. They're probably pretty smart, because the nonprofit hospital wants smart people on their board. Who are the people that the candidates for governor, senator, and congressman go to see in each community all over their state right off the bat when they're thinking about running for office? The most prominent people in the community, depending on what party there are, but since both parties, by chance, will probably be represented on the board. So what happens when somebody somebody on the board, not because he's on the board, but just because he likes this person, does a fundraiser for him, so and such and such and such, the person wins, they go to Washington, all of a sudden a big bill comes up to reform healthcare and reduce the role of tertiary care hospitals so they can expand the role of primary care and keep people healthy instead of making them sick, right? Who is to lose at that? The hospital. What happens? The senator gets a call. You know, remember Joe, Senator so-and-so, when I did that fundraiser for you, I got a favor to ask you. You know, our little hospital here in whatever county is going to close if this bill passes, because we can't afford this unless we get a certain number of MRIs or whatever it is. So the lobbying is unbelievable because it's not actually done by lobbyists. It's done by people in the community. And those are, in the long run, believe it or not, the most important people for any politician are the people in the community who spread the word, who are looked up to, and those are the people on hospital boards. So the pressure against any kind of change, it's not just, the tort lawyers and the pharmaceutical lobbyists and all this kind of stuff that always pointed out in the newspapers. We're doing this to ourselves. I once had a guy who was a really prominent businessman, very successful guy in Vermont. He's on the board of the hospital. Big Republican, but it doesn't, in Vermont, we're all pals, believe it or not. It's one of the last states in the country we still talk to each other. And he came up and said, "Governor, you've got to do something about health care. This thing's just killing us." And I said, "Angelo, aren't you on the board of the medical center?" He said, "Yeah, I am." I said, "Didn't you just have a $350 million expansion?" He said, "Yeah, boy, we really need it. The hospital's going to look great." I said, "Just exactly how did you think that was going to be paid for?" "Well, we bonded for it." "And how are the bonds going to be paid off?" "Well, the insurance premiums are going to go up because we're going to have to do more things, and that's going to help us pay the bonds off." So we're doing it to ourselves. Even the business people who complain about healthcare costs going up are driving them up because they want their community to have the best of hospitals. If you get rid of fee-for-service medicine, at least what you do is make that more transparent. Because like your example, except doing it by procedure, you now do it for your whole year's worth of healthcare. You now have a budget. In the case of Medicare, the Congress of the United States could say, okay, we're only giving Medicare a 2% budget this year, so providers all over the country live with it. I don't think you'd get, certainly in the beginning, like for the first 30 years, you wouldn't get much decrease in quality of health care because we spend 70% more of a higher percentage of our GNP than the next highest expenditure, which is Canada. We spend 70% more as a percentage of GNP than Canada. So you'd really have to be a dishonest, horrible person to be cutting people off from procedures they don't know. They don't need, or they do need. We don't have to do that. We've got so much fat in our system, we just can't get at it because the investment that we have in our current infrastructure is so enormous that the political power extends deepest into every small community in America that we in some ways are our own worst enemies. And that's another reason that some of this has to come from the bottom up. Because until you can have this discussion about do we really have to have our hospital or can we somehow share one with the other counties, then cost control is going to be really hard. I'm going to defer to the microphone person, having learned my lesson the last time. Okay.
I have the microphone now. So two things. One, when you were talking about the costs in hospitals and whatnot, is what is feeding into that in part because when you get a bill from a procedure at the hospital, it's not a procedure for having your thyroid out, and then that's a flat fee.
Right.
It's okay, here was what the audiologist charged, and here's what the anesthesiologist charged, and here's what the surgeon charged, and here's for the aspirin, and here's for the calcium, and here's for this, so that each one of those things has a markup because they're getting a profit on each one. So one question is that contributing to it? And the other question I had is when you were describing these organizations, and you said everything would be contained within the organization, I'm a patient, I don't want that doctor, I want the doctor over here. Can I still have access?
Let's take that second question
Okay.
first. You can take an out-of-patient doctor, out-of-system doctor, but it's going to cost you more. And that's why I think this is a good system, because as long as you have that option, be my guest. That's how a market. Remember, I said we're terrible at buying health care, but I think we're pretty good as a people about buying health insurance. So you have to decide whether it's worth it for you to, let's just say, pay 35% more on your health insurance premiums and go outside of the system and have more. And you can actually do some of that today. So that you can make consumer choice because we do great buying insurance. We do make sensible decisions in the aggregate. Now, the question about the bills, there's been a lot written about this, and I don't subscribe to any of it. It has a lot to, of course it has a lot to do with driving the healthcare. Anybody's gotten a bill lately from a complicated, it's a joke, it's preposterous. It's really a meaningless exercise, because even if you could figure it all out, it probably half the stuff, I mean, somebody did a study, I think it was Consumer Reports, that showed in some cases 90% of what was in the bill was wrong. So this is crazy. Why not throw the whole system out? Why get a bill at all? Why not say, okay, you got my $10,000 for the year, now I need a thyroid operation, do it. Now, I'd like the bill, not because I want you to itemize all the costs, because I want to know exactly what you did to me. So I'd like, yeah, if you gave me aspirin or you gave me this, I'd like to know that, But you can put any number you want on there because I've already paid my $10,000 for your year. And if I don't see you at all, it still costs me $10,000 because that's what we all paid. Now, an actuary will have to figure out what that number really is. It's not $10,000. Maybe it's a little more, maybe it's a little less, depending on where you live, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't fool with this fixing the bill stuff. We've been talking about that for 20 years. I'd get rid of the bills altogether. Say, I paid you, you do what you have to do to make me healthy, and better yet, do what you have to do to keep me healthy so I don't need the thyroid operation in the first place.
Last question.
Governor Dean, I'm a student here at St. Anselm College, and I want to shift gears just a little bit. I was curious, what are your thoughts on the high and rising costs of education? Should they be fixed? Is there anything that needs to be done about it, and what?
This is really interesting, the rising cost of education. They should be fixed. The only reason that higher education has gotten away with this is because healthcare costs are worse, but higher education costs have been appalling. If healthcare costs have gone up between 2.5 and 3 times the rate of inflation, higher education costs have gone up at least twice the rate of inflation for 30 years. And they're overbuilt. And in some ways, here's the problem. The short-term political fix probably makes it worse. That is, making student loans more available makes it worse. Because now we just give the university administrations more ability to raise their prices, which you eventually have to pay. Now, Oregon just passed a really interesting bill. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I have no idea how the finances are going to work out. What the bill essentially is if you go to one of the Oregon state colleges or universities, and you have to borrow money, you borrow the money, and then you pay, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's either 3 or 5 or 10, I can't remember, percent of your income for 10 years. And if that doesn't pay the loans back, that's the end of it. You don't owe anything more anyway. Now, the reason I kind of like that is, first of all, it gives you some visibility. Because I think a lot of kids sign up for these loans without really realizing how awful it's going to try to be and how hard it is to get a job that pays enough to pay you back and so forth and so on. The second thing it does is it actually does have the effect of doing something to the university administration which needs to be done, but can't be done short-term as the standard consumer relationship. That is, what's going to happen, what is happening now, because that higher education actually is a free market system, which is distorted by student loans in some ways, and it's at least the system we have today. What is happening now, because the costs are so high, is that kids are now deciding, well, I'm not going to go. I don't want to pick on St. Anselm's because I don't even know what the cost is. Let's just pretend we're talking about another state. I'm not going to go to Berkeley because I don't know what it costs, but let's suppose it costs $25,000, $30,000 a year for in-state. Because if I do 2 years of community college first at a quarter of the price and I live at home, then that's 2 years I don't have to pay for, so I'll just go for the last 2 years. Now, Berkeley's one of the great public colleges of the country. I think maybe it's the #1 public college in the country. And the decisions are being made by like that all over the country. People are saying, well, when I was growing up, my generation, well, Romney said it when he was running, borrow the money, talk to your aunt, go to the best place you can. That's not so true anymore. That's fine when Romney was a kid, since he didn't have to worry about money anyway. But it's not so true of the average kid now. I do a lot of counseling for medical students kids who are trying to become medical students, and the first thing I say is don't take debt. Work for the armed services, work for the Indian Health Services, I don't care what you do. But if you graduate, a lot of kids I know want to go and get into primary care. If you come out of medical school with a $200,000 debt, you're an indentured servant for the rest of your life if you go into primary care. You can't educate your kids and you never get out of debt because you can never make enough except on Park Avenue or Rodeo Drive in primary care to pay off those debts and have a reasonable kind of lifestyle. You can't do it. So we're enabling the medical schools to run up their tuitions like crazy because you'll pay it in the short term even if you have to borrow the money. And once you've borrowed the money, it's not their problem anymore. So this Oregon thing I like because if you purely use free market stuff, all of a sudden there's a big adjustment and people really aren't probably getting as good an education as they could. But if you do what Oregon's doing, and I'm not endorsing this because I'm intrigued by it and I want to know more about it. But it's such an interesting pattern because a smart administration, and I assume these universities are run by smart people, is going to say, if we lend this guy or this gal $50,000 and they pay 10% of their income back, unless they become somebody with an income greater than X, whatever it is, then we're not going to get paid back. And what is the average income level of our graduates? Washington Monthly did just a great article. It ranked the top colleges in the country not by prestige and all that stuff, so Princeton, Harvard, Yale, blah, blah, blah. It ranked them by return on investment. What was your cost going in and what did you make coming out? It's a very different list. So they have access to those figures. So I think what they're doing is essentially introducing market economics that works into higher education with an attempt to fend off the trauma of the pure market-based stuff. I actually think that if we don't fix this, and it may be too late, that sometime 3 to 5 years from now, somebody's going to go on change.org or UPower and get together a petition of 500,000 people that just say, starting in January, we're not paying our student loans, period. That's a $5.6 trillion problem, $4.5 trillion problem. And if that happens, you know, the financial crisis that we just had is going to look reasonably small by comparison. So this is a really urgent problem. It calls for creative solutions. And I would just say, again, let's take a look at what Oregon did, because we're going to have to put some financial consequences for the administrations of these universities building Cadillacs. It's not just about competing based on what you can offer every student. It's also based on what you ought to be able to charge students. The current system, which gives you all the money up front when you're 18 years old, is not a good system for doing that. Thanks very much.